I will not be silent. I will not be silent. Who are you to tell me to be silent?
The morning rain beat a relentless rhythm against the tall, arched windows of the courthouse, washing the city streets in a cold, unforgiving gray. As I walked into my private chambers and lifted the heavy black robe from its hook, I felt that familiar, dull tightness in my chest. It is a weight that never fully dissipates, no matter how many decades you spend presiding over the broken pieces of human lives. Most people who follow my work see the clips that go viral, the moments where I hand out lollipops to children, or the times I dismiss a parking ticket for a single mother who is clearly drowning in the tides of bad luck. They see the Judge Boyd who smiles, the man who believes that the law must have a beating heart to be valid. I do believe in that. I believe in mercy, in the radical power of second chances, and in the idea that a human being is always more than their worst mistake. But there is a shadow side to this courtroom, a side that rarely finds its way into the heartwarming montages on social media. It is a side where the damage is not an accident of circumstance or a momentary lapse in judgment. It is a side where harm is calculated, structured, and repeated with surgical precision over years until it becomes an invisible system of destruction. This is the side of justice that requires a different kind of strength, a cold, unyielding clarity. I took my seat on the high bench and looked out over the gallery, and the contrast was immediate and almost unbearable. On the left side sat the defense team, corporate lawyers in silk ties, whispering in hushed tones, exuding the quiet, polished confidence of men who had spent their entire careers turning legal complexity into a shield for the powerful. On the right side sat the victims. They were mostly older men and women, their shoulders bent forward as if carrying a physical burden, their clothes worn thin by time and hardship, their hands clutched, faded folders filled with bank statements that were no longer just paper, they were the documented death certificates of their dreams. At the center of it all sat Richard Sterling. Even in this room, under the gaze of those he had ruined, he carried himself like a man who still owned the world. Perfectly styled silver hair, a suit tailored with a precision that likely cost more than the annual pension of any person sitting to his right. He looked straight ahead, his posture as rigid as the corporate towers he once commanded. Richard Sterling was the former CEO of Apex Vanguard Financial, once hailed as a visionary and a philanthropist. But as I opened the thick stack of forensic reports on my desk, I reminded myself of one fundamental truth. The law does not care about names carved into the marble of hospital wings. It cares about the consequences carved into human lives. I closed the first file slowly, the sound echoing in the sudden silence of the room. The battle lines were drawn, and today, power would finally have to answer to something it could not buy. The room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence as I adjusted my glasses and looked down at the mountain of files on my bench. These were not just pages of paper. They were the DNA of a disaster written in the cold, unyielding language of numbers. Forensic accounting is often seen as a dry profession, but if you listen closely enough, the data begins to scream. I had spent the entire weekend tracing digital breadcrumbs, watching how Richard Sterling moved millions across borders with a single keystroke, while 500 families slept soundly. They were unaware that the foundation of their lives was being dissolved beneath them by a courtroom fantasy that felt all too real. I looked directly at Sterling, who sat there with the calculated indifference of a man who believed complexity was a sanctuary. In my courtroom, complexity does not hide the truth. It only highlights the intent. I began to speak, my voice intentionally low, forcing every high-priced attorney in the room to lean in just to hear the weight of the evidence. I told him that I had reviewed the offshore transfers and seen the shell companies used to hide the life savings of the innocent. These were the college tuitions of grandchildren and the emergency funds of widows, treated as mere opportunities for extraction. I tapped the thickest file gently to remind the room that most people think of a robbery as a man in a mask with a gun. That kind of crime is loud and fast. But what Richard did was an invisible system of destruction. He robbed these families while they were at work, while they were at church, and while they were raising their children. They trusted that the system they contributed to would protect them, but he used that trust as collateral. You didn't just steal currency, Richard. You stole the peace of mind that a 70-year-old man traded 40 years of sweat and blood to earn. The corporate lawyers shifted in their seats as one of them stood up to object, trying to hide behind market volatility. I didn't even look at him, keeping my eyes locked on Sterling so he could feel the literal weight of those files. I told him that in this room, we do not balance books or offset harm with future profit margins. We balance human lives. Right now, the scales of justice are tipped so far against him that all the billions in the world cannot move them back. This was not a mere verdict. It was the moment truth became louder than simulated power. I looked toward the right side of the gallery, where the air felt thinner, heavy with the weight of decades of uncompensated labor. These weren't just names on a legal docket. They were the living, breathing evidence of a betrayal that no corporate bank could ever fully quantify. I called for the victims to speak, not to provide evidence. The forensic reports had already done that, but to restore the humanity that Richard Sterling had so efficiently stripped away. I needed the court to hear the voices that the spreadsheets had silenced. Arthur Miller stood up slowly, his hands trembling as he gripped the railing of the witness stand, his wife holding his arm as if the floor itself might disappear. He spoke about his 42 years at the auto plant, a lifetime of grease, heat, and double shifts, all performed under the promise of a dignified sunset. Arthur didn't talk about interest rates or investment portfolios. He talked about the simple dignity of being able to retire without fear. His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of a life spent following the rules of a game that had been rigged against him. The silence that followed his testimony was an indictment of every loophole and offshore account Sterling had ever signed his name to. Arthur looked directly at the defendant and asked a question that cut through the corporate jargon. My wife still asks me what we did wrong. It was a question that had no answer in a legal textbook because their only crime was believing in the safety and dignity of the American system. As Arthur sat down, the room felt suspended in a collective grief that demanded more than just a ruling. Then came Evelyn Hayes, her voice barely a whisper yet louder than any legal objection. She talked about her husband's final days and how he spent his last breaths apologizing to her. He wasn't apologizing for being sick. He was apologizing because the 40 years of savings they thought were safe had been treated as acceptable collateral. She held a soaked tissue, a small, fragile symbol of a loss that was too large for this room to contain. I watched Sterling as she spoke, looking for a crack in the armor, a sign that the human cost was finally registering. This was no longer a financial case. It was a trial about the fundamental collapse of trust. As a judge, I have seen many things, but watching an honest woman weep for a husband who died feeling like a failure because of someone else's greed is a different kind of pain. The air in the courtroom was now thick with a collective demand for accountability. Justice is often portrayed as blind, but in this moment, I needed the law to have eyes that could see the faces behind the numbers. The lead counsel for the defense stood up, smoothing the front of his bespoke suit, radiating the kind of confidence that comes from a career spent navigating the gray areas of the law. He began to speak about market volatility, unforeseen economic shifts, and the unfortunate complexities of high-stakes financial management. To him, the thousands of pages of forensic evidence were merely a set of variables to be debated, a series of technicalities that could be explained away with enough jargon. I sat back in my chair, watching as he tried to turn a decade of systematic theft into a simple matter of a bad quarter. It was a performance designed to distance his client from the human wreckage sitting only feet away. I didn't let him finish the sentence. I didn't need a gavel to command the room. The silence that followed my interruption was heavy enough. "Counsel," I said, my voice steady but carrying a sharp edge of clarity, "do not sit here and tell me about market volatility when the evidence shows a deliberate redirection of funds into private offshore accounts." I looked over the bench at the defendant, who was still trying to maintain his mask of executive indifference. A misjudgment is a mistake in a calculation. What we see here is a blueprint for betrayal, a structured extraction of wealth from people who had no way to defend themselves. The defense tried to pivot, suggesting that if Richard Sterling were allowed to remain free, he could use his genius to generate restitution for the families. It was the ultimate corporate argument, that the man who broke the system was the only one qualified to fix it. I looked at the Millers, then at Mrs. Hayes, and I saw the exhaustion in their eyes. They weren't looking for a return on investment anymore. They were looking for a truth that was louder than his lawyers. I told the council that the law is not a balance sheet where harm can be offset by a future promise of profit. You cannot restitute the years of sleep lost to fear, and you certainly cannot restitute the dignity of a man who died feeling like he had failed his family because his life savings had vanished. This was the moment the illusion of Sterling's power truly began to dissolve in the room. For years, he had operated under the belief that wealth and complexity made him untouchable, that as long as the paperwork was dense enough, no one would look for the soul beneath it. But the authority of this courtroom is not simulated. It is built on the reality of the consequences he created. I informed the defense that we would not be discussing fiduciary nuances any further. We were here to discuss accountability, and the price of that accountability was about to become very real. Richard Sterling stood up. The entire courtroom held its breath, a tension so thick you could hear the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock behind the bench. This was the moment every financial genius attempts to seize when the walls finally close, in the moment they try to claw back a shred of their lost power through the sheer force of polished rhetoric. He didn't look at the victims, the men and women he viewed as nothing more than rounding errors in his spreadsheets. He looked directly at me, his silver eyes maintaining a cold, defiant arrogance even as he stood in the shadow of a criminal sentence. He began to speak of his contributions to society. He recited a long, rehearsed list of the hospitals that bore his name, the libraries he had inaugurated, and the prestigious charities he had funneled millions into over the last decade. In Sterling's warped logic, these acts of generosity were like a check he could use to buy his way out of the suffering he had engineered. He painted a picture of himself as a misunderstood savior of the economy, a man who created thousands of jobs and had simply taken a necessary risk in an unstable market. He wanted me to believe he was a victim of circumstance rather than the architect of a catastrophe. I let him speak. I wanted every word of that arrogance etched into the record so that history would show he was given every opportunity to be heard. But when he began to describe the theft of pension funds as a necessary part of a risk restructuring strategy, I raised my hand. The silence that followed was immediate, heavy as a lead weight. "Mr. Sterling," I said, my voice steady and terrifyingly calm, "charity is not a shield you can use to bribe justice. You cannot build a monument using bricks taken from the bones of the working class and expect us to applaud its beauty." I stood up and walked slowly along the length of the bench, the sound of my shoes echoing like dry cracks against the wooden floor. "You pride yourself on your intelligence, on your ability to see opportunities that others miss. But let me tell you something. Intelligence without morality is nothing more than a highly efficient tool for creating human suffering on a massive scale." I stopped directly in front of him, looking deep into the eyes that had once commanded a financial empire. "You believed that rules were only for people who weren't smart enough to bypass them. You believed your wealth placed you above the consequences of the law. That delusion is the most dangerous disease in any society. And today, that delusion ends here." The rain outside seemed to intensify, the water drumming against the courthouse windows like the collective heartbeat of the families who had waited far too long for this moment. Sterling began to tremble, a small, microscopic crack appearing in his perfect executive veneer. I looked down at Arthur Miller and Evelyn Hayes, who were gripping each other's hands, and I saw that truth had finally reclaimed its rightful place. Richard Sterling thought he was here to defend his legacy. He didn't understand that his legacy had turned to ash the moment he decided his luxury was more important than the survival of 500 families. "Richard," I said, sitting back down and picking up my fountain pen to finalize the judgment, "you are not here because the market failed. You are here because you failed at being a decent human being." The weight of the coming sentence filled every corner of the room, ready to descend on the man who had treated the lives of others as acceptable collateral. It was time to stop talking about financial losses and start talking about the price of a betrayed soul. I looked down at the defense table, where the lead attorney was still hovering, his mouth slightly open, as if he had one more technicality, one more, but to offer the court. He wanted to talk about restitution again. He wanted to argue that Richard Sterling was a resource that would be wasted behind bars. It is the oldest trick in the book for men like this to suggest that their utility to the economy is so great that they should be exempt from the consequences of the law. I didn't give him the chance to speak. The time for debate had passed, and the air in the room was now heavy with the finality of what was about to happen. "Counsel, sit down," I said, the words cutting through the tension like a blade. "I have heard enough about your client's potential for restitution. You cannot restitute the years of sleep lost to the terror of poverty. You cannot restitute the final days of a man who died feeling like he had failed his family because his life savings had been turned into someone else's offshore bonus. The law is not a corporate balance sheet where harm can be offset by a future promise of profit. We are not here to negotiate a settlement. We are here to deliver justice." I turned my attention fully to Richard Sterling. He was no longer looking at me with that practiced executive calm. He was pale. His hands gripped the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles were white. For the first time in his life, he was realizing that he was in a room where his net worth was exactly zero. In this square of the world, his influence had evaporated. "Richard," I continued, my voice echoing off the high marble walls, "you believed that because your crimes were committed with a pen and a computer instead of a pry bar and a mask, they were somehow less violent. You were wrong. You didn't just take money, you broke the social contract that holds us all together." The prosecution had requested 30 years. The defense had begged for 5. Both numbers felt arbitrary when compared to the 500 lives that had been permanently altered. I picked up the sentencing order, the paper feeling heavy in my hand. "Richard Sterling, you stand before this court convicted of systematic deception, grand larceny, and a cold-blooded betrayal of trust. You were praised for your intelligence, but intelligence without morality is just a more efficient way to destroy the lives of others. You thought you were above consequence. Today, the law reminds you that you are not." I leaned forward, looking past the lawyers, and directly at the man who had treated human beings like acceptable collateral. The room was so silent you could hear the rain tapping against the glass like 1,000 ghosts asking for their lives back. "I have reached a decision," I said, and as I spoke those words, I felt the collective weight of the gallery behind me, and it is a decision that will ensure you finally understand the cost of every dollar you stole. I reached for the gavel, but I didn't strike it yet. I wanted the silence to do the heavy lifting first. I looked at Richard Sterling, and for the first time, I saw the sweat on his brow, the slight tremor in his hands that no amount of expensive tailoring could hide. He was finally standing at the edge of a cliff he had built himself, and there were no more lawyers, no more offshore accounts, and no more technicalities to catch him. I told him to stand and face the court, not as a CEO, not as a billionaire, but as a man whose actions had consequences that could no longer be ignored. "Richard Sterling," I began, my voice steady and echoing through the high arch ceiling of the room. "You have spent your life believing that numbers are the only thing that matters. You believed that if the profit margin was high enough, the human cost was invisible. Today, that ledger is being closed. For the systematic destruction of the lives of 500 families, for the theft of dignity and the betrayal of a community's trust, I am sentencing you to 22 years in federal prison." A sharp, collective intake of breath moved through the gallery like a wave, but I wasn't finished. I leaned forward, looking directly into his eyes, stripping away the last of his executive shield. "But your sentence does not end with a cell door. The law is often criticized for being cold. But in this courtroom, we remember that justice must have a soul. Every single month for the next 22 years, on the exact day those pension checks were meant to arrive in the mailboxes of the families you robbed, you will sit in a federal facility with a probation officer. You will not be given a financial report or a market analysis. You will be given a book. In that book are the names and the photographs of every single person you affected." I paused, letting the weight of that reality settle on him. "You will read those names aloud, Richard, one by one, all 500 of them. You will look at their faces, you will see the age in their eyes, and you will speak their names into the air. Because, for a decade, you treated these people as acceptable collateral. You treated them as invisible data points on a spreadsheet. But names are where humanity begins. You will spend your time in that cell, learning that a name has more weight than $1 billion. And you will not be allowed to forget a single one of them." The sound of the handcuffs clicking was quiet, but in that silent room, it sounded like a thunderclap. It was the sound of a closing door, the sound of power finally meeting a boundary it could not negotiate with. As the guard stepped forward to lead him away, Richard Sterling didn't look like a titan of industry anymore. He looked small. He looked like a man who had finally realized that his wealth was a phantom and his legacy was a ruin. I looked at Arthur Miller and Evelyn Hayes, and I saw them exhale a deep, painful release of a burden they had carried for years without permission to speak its name. Justice didn't bring the money back, but it brought something more valuable. The truth was finally louder than the lie. I remained seated long after the bailiffs had led Richard Sterling through the heavy steel doors, and the courtroom had finally emptied. The silence that filled the space now was different from the tense, suffocating quiet of the trial. This was a hollow silence, the kind that follows a great storm. I looked out at the gallery where the victims had sat for weeks. They were gone now, back to their lives, back to the small homes and the modest kitchens where they would continue to navigate the wreckage Sterling had left behind. Justice, I've learned over many years, does not alter the world instantly. It does not put the money back into the accounts or bring back the years of lost sleep, but it alters our understanding within the world. It provides a boundary, a declaration that even the most calculated systems of destruction eventually hit a wall. Later, in my private chambers, I unbuttoned the heavy black robe and hung it back on its hook. It felt heavier today than it did this morning. My assistant, Marcus, walked in and placed a glass of water on my desk, his expression uncharacteristically somber. "That was a heavy one, Judge," he said quietly. I nodded, looking out at the rain-soaked streets below. The city was still moving, the sirens were still wailing in the distance, and the gray clouds still hung low over the skyline. "They are all heavy, Marcus," I replied. "Every case is the same at its core. Someone, somewhere, used power without ever stopping to calculate its human cost." We talked for a moment about Sterling's sentence, not the 22 years of prison, but the 22 years of names. Marcus asked if I thought Sterling would ever truly understand what he had done. I paused, thinking of the look in his eyes as the handcuffs clicked shut. "I think understanding is not an instant event," I said. "It arrives slowly, painfully, and often too late to undo the past. But forcing him to speak those names is the only way to break the illusion he lived in. He can no longer hide behind a spreadsheet. He has to meet the eyes of the people he turned into collateral." I prepared to leave for the day, but I knew my work was far from over. There would be more cases tomorrow. Smaller cases, everyday cases, people who would never appear in national headlines, but whose lives carried just as much weight as those I saw today. As I walked out of the courthouse and into the cool evening air, I felt a sense of quiet clarity. In a world that often feels like it is run by the loudest voices and the deepest pockets, the courtroom remains the one place where a simple truth can dismantle an empire. Justice is not about perfection. It is about the endurance of the human spirit. It is about the Millers and the Hayeses of the world standing up and saying, "I am here and I matter." And as long as there is a truth left unheard, the work is never finished. As I drove home through the city lights, I understood something simple and permanent. Power may build the towers, but truth is what keeps the foundation from crumbling. And today, the truth was finally louder than the power.